Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the temperaments, the 4 basic temperaments. But before we get into them, I just want to show that I believe there's a biblical basis for even studying these kinds of things and incorporating the concepts into our lives. Obviously, the temperaments themselves are not in the scriptures. You're not going to find them. You're not going to find descriptions of them. But Psalm 139 talks about the intimacy that we have with God, how well he knows us. You know, you've searched me, you know when I sit, when I rise, you perceive my thoughts from afar. It goes on to say how he knit us together in our mother's womb and we're fearfully and wonderfully made, and how all the days ordained for us were written before one of them came to be. God made us uniquely, individually, and he did so for a purpose. So we need to, he knows us better than we can ever know ourselves. But we need to know ourselves so that we know how he wants to use us and we can fulfill the plans he has for us. Romans 12:3 says, "For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you." I have found with women, at least the women that I know, it's very rare that I come across someone who has too high of an opinion of themselves. It's usually the exact opposite. It's this, I can't do anything, I have no value. And actually, that is a form of pride, because your focus is on yourself, whether you're thinking you're worthless or whether you're thinking you're better than everyone. So Scripture tells us to have a sober opinion, sober judgment of ourselves, which means an honest evaluation. And understanding the temperaments is just another piece of the puzzle that can help us to do that. The greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus also says, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this all men will know that you're my disciple if you love one another." That's from John 13:34 and 35. It's one of our highest calling is to love each other. And I think one of the main reasons that we have difficulty with that is because we don't understand each other. People get on our nerves because they do things that we would never do. They react in ways that we don't understand. And so as we begin to look at the temperaments, we can see, oh, that's what motivates them. That's kind of where they're coming from, and it helps us to know them better, which enables us to love them more. But then there's also the balance, because we don't want this to all be, oh, about me and who I am and what my characteristics are. And so just to keep things in perspective, 1 Corinthians 4:7, "Who makes you different from anyone else? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did?" So everything we have and everything we are is from God. And then 2 Corinthians 3:5, "Not that we're competent in ourselves to claim anything for ourselves, but our competence comes from God." So we want to keep it in perspective. It's important for us to know ourselves, but under the umbrella of it's all about God, not about us. We just want to understand this so that we can be more effective tools in his hands. And as a mom, this can help us to understand our kids better. With my kids, Alexa is a carbon copy of me. So sometimes we would, butt heads because we were so similar, but I got her. I knew how she thought. I understood where she was coming from. Andrew was a complete mystery to me because he's not like my husband, he's not like Gary, and he's not like me. And so the temperaments really helped me to understand him and relate to him better. They also helped me to understand myself better in some areas that really made a difference for me. So this has been a very encouraging and practical, very helpful study for me, and so that's why I appreciate the opportunity to share it. All the temperaments go back to Hippocrates, and he believed that there were 4 fluids in the body. That's why the names of these things are strange. He believed there were 4 fluids in the body. These fluids are in the body. He believed that if you had a greater quantity of one over the other, then this would be your temperament. Now, of course, they've thrown that out, but they've kept the names. So we just have to understand some terms, things we're probably familiar with. Optimist tends to see the good in everything and believes that everything will end up well. Pessimist is the exact opposite. They tend to see the downside first and honestly believe in the final analysis things are not going to work out. The next one's introvert and extrovert. I learned an aspect of them through this that I'd never seen before. I knew that extroverts were outgoing and introverts were more inward. But what I didn't understand was extroverts recharge with other people. They need to be with other people to charge their batteries, whereas introverts need to be alone to recharge. And they get drained if they're with people, and extroverts get drained if they're by themselves. And usually introverts marry extroverts. But again, if you can understand that, then you can say, oh, okay, they're not just being difficult, whether it's they want to be out and you want to be home or vice versa. So that was really helpful to me. So, are you a popular sanguine, a perfect melancholy, a powerful choleric, or a peaceful phlegmatic. We're going to take a look at each of these, and the way the book that I got the material from sets it up, and I really like that, is it looks at all the positive qualities of each, and then shows when those positives are taken to an extreme, that's when they become negatives. And it's from Florence Littauer's book, Personality Plus. These also, if you're familiar with Gary Smalley and John Trent, they did a study called personality traits, personality types, and they equated each of these with an animal. And so in your notes it's there, which goes with which, and I'm going to mention it as we get to each of them. So there's 3 goals, I think, in trying to understand the temperaments. First, so that we can better understand ourselves and allow that if we know ourselves better, we can surrender more of ourselves to God and allow Him to accentuate the positives and eliminate the negatives. We can also gain another measure, what word do I want? Standard besides ourselves to measure or to understand others. We see the world through our temperament. It's how we're wired. And we judge everyone against that, not necessarily intentionally, but because we think, well, why would they do that? I would never do that. Well, that's because they're wired differently. They're not necessarily trying to be difficult. So it helps us to understand and love the people around us. And it can help us to determine what part we play in the body of Christ, as well as how we can best parent our kids. Because when we understand who we are, we understand who they are, we can meet their needs better, we can direct them in a more functional way, in a better way. Because you can't treat all your kids the same because they're not the same. We already know that, but if we can kind of understand how they're different, how they think, it can make all the difference in the world. So, we're going to start with the popular sanguine. Now, at the end, I'm going to be handing out, I know I have a ton here, but that's because Gary and I are teaching this on Sunday morning at Sunday school. It just happened to coordinate. We're doing he's teaching a series on spiritual gifts, and he had said to me, oh, there were more weeks than videos. And so he said, I thought we could do the temperaments. I said, yeah, no problem. And it just happens to turn out that it's this Sunday that we're doing that. And I'm going to hand out a thing that has a test that you can take. Hopefully, as I describe these things, you're going to see yourself, and you're going to know which one you are. You may already know. But if not, I have a little test that I put together that you can take to sort of help fine-tune it. And then there's a sheet that has the main attributes of all 4 of them, so you don't have to write everything down. But I'll give that to you at the end. So the popular sanguine, that is, they are extroverts and optimists. Their goal is to have fun. The biblical example is Peter. And they are the talkers. Their strengths. Oh, and the Gary Smalley, John Trent parallel is the otter. He calls these people the otters. Their strengths. They're very childlike. They love fun and games. They love to be the center of attention. They're very dramatic, but they're also magnetic. They're not dramatic in, oh, woe is me. They're just, people are absolutely drawn to them. They love to know every detail of everything. They want to be in the middle of and a part of everything. They gravitate towards excitement. They tend to be very spontaneous, and they're circumstantial in the sense that these are the people who are always losing their keys. Like they're always misplacing things because they just don't pay close enough attention because they're on to one thing and then on to another. The next characteristic, the next strength is they have a bubbly personality. They have a natural charisma. They have an abundance of energy and enthusiasm. They love to be, they enjoy popularity. They love to have people around. They're great storytellers. You know when you go into a party and there's one person who everybody's gathered around and they're telling about what happened to them? That's probably a popular sanguine. They're motivators. They're touchy-feely. These are the huggers amongst us. They're also great starters. They're visionaries and they're very creative. So those are their strengths. When strengths are taken to an extreme, they become weaknesses. So, okay, they're childlike, but what do you think about? What are some of the negative things of being childlike? They tend to be very self-centered. They tend to be insensitive to others because they just don't pay attention. They just don't really care when they're out of balance. They have bad memories, again, because they don't pay attention. They tend to be immature, or they can be in the negative realm, and they're fickle and forgetful. They have bubbly personalities that draw people to them, but sometimes they talk too much, and they have this, can you top this? They tend to, with their stories, exaggerate. Now, sometimes that just makes it more colorful, but sometimes they're doing it to top others, and so they're lying. I mean, they're just saying things that aren't true, but they're presenting them in a way that they are true. They sometimes see people as an audience. They tend to have a lot of acquaintances but few friends. They don't tend to have deep relationships. And they're the kind of people that when you're in a group with them and you're talking, you're afraid to take a breath because you know they're just going to jump in. As soon as there's a space, they're going to jump in. They're great starters but not good finishers. They tend to avoid work at all costs. They are disorganized, and sometimes they use that as an excuse not to do. You know, they just intentionally don't. I mean, they're not wired that way to be organized, but that's kind of the way they get out of things. And they're really great at volunteering. They hear about a need, and they're like, yes, I'll do it, but then they tend not to follow through. Again, that's in the extreme, that's in the negative. So popular sanguine, I'm sure people are coming to your mind who fit this description, which is a good thing. That's how we, you know, when we suddenly picture somebody who embodies those traits, it helps us to understand that temperament better. Okay, the second one is the perfect melancholy. They are introverts and pessimists. Their goal is perfection and order. Your biblical example is Moses, and these are the thinkers. Now, the Smalley Trent calls these people the beavers, if you're familiar with that. Their strengths, they're deep, quiet, thoughtful, and analytical. They tend to be very serious, very reserved. They're your planners. They're your list makers. It's funny, Andrew is my melancholy. And I remember when he was little, he'd have a day off from school, and he'd wake up that morning, and he'd be like, what's the plan? I'm like, you're 6 years old. Like, what do you mean, what's the plan? Stay in your pajamas, let's play, but he always wanted a plan. He wanted a plan, and that wasn't an issue or problem, but I was just kind of like, I don't get it. Like, you're too young to think that way, but this is how he is. They're great counselors. They tend to have few friends. They don't have a real large circle, but they tend to be very faithful and deep relationships. They're creative and inventive. This is the temperament that has genius tendencies. They believe like Michelangelo was a perfect melancholy. They're the most talented and creative of the four temperaments. They're perfectionists and they love order. So they're accurate, they're consistent, they're practical, they're very detailed oriented. Andrew's he's an accountant. I mean, it fits perfectly with his temperament. Not that other temperaments couldn't be, but that's one way you can kind of see. They tend to be very meticulously groomed. You know that woman that everybody, you know, it's just like you just got yourself together to get to Bible study or to get to school or to get to wherever you go. And they are perfectly dressed, everything is pressed, not a hair out of place, probably a perfect melancholy. And they tend to be very economical because they're not wasteful. Now some people say cheap to the extent, you know, if it goes that way. So those are their strengths. Their weaknesses, they're deep, quiet, and thoughtful, but they tend to be too intense, and they tend to overanalyze things. They just think things through too much. Some things they really just need to let go of, but because that's their bent, in the negative and the extreme, it can really work against them. As a result, they can have a superior attitude, because they are so intellectual, and they are such deep thinkers, and a lack of humor. They can be overly sensitive. If you have someone in your life who you kind of have to walk on eggshells around, you know, you don't want to upset them because you just know, and it's just not worth it to upset them. That's probably a perfect melancholy. And they tend to be very predictable, which can be a good thing, but it can also, if it's to the extreme, you know, it could result in being boring. They just do the same things all the time. They're creative and inventive, but they tend easily towards depression. They can be gloomy people. If you think about Winnie the Pooh, Eeyore would have been a perfect melancholy. Tigger would probably be your sanguine. Eeyore, because, you know, woe is me, no one loves me. They tend to, you know, in the negative, again, in the extreme, to be like, I can't do anything right. But they also manipulate people with their moods, because they'll say things like that because they want you to say, oh no, you know, they want you to compliment them so they can manipulate people. Also, they can control people with their moods because they know that people don't want to offend them or because they're overly sensitive. So sometimes they can use that to their advantage, and of course that's not a positive. That's not a positive thing. They tend to have a low self-image and are a harsh judge of themselves. They're perfectionists, which can be good. I mean, obviously that term in itself has some negative connotations, but they tend to procrastinate because everything has to be right and perfect before they start, and so consequently they never start things. And they sometimes overplan, and they'll have unrealistic demands of others because they've thought everything through and planned it, and so they assume everyone else does that. And it's interesting because opposites attract. So sanguines, your life of the parties, tend to marry perfect melancholies, which, you know, you can see how that they complement and balance each other, but how that can be difficult. there can be a lot of strife between sanguines and melancholies, because a sanguine doesn't even think about what they're saying after it comes out of their mouth. And a perfect melancholy would never say anything without deeply thinking it through. That's why they're overly sensitive. So you've got these sanguines who are just saying things, and then a minute later they forget what it is. And the perfect melancholy is like, well, why would you say that? Because they assumed that it was intentional, that they had thought through it. So you can see how we can have some issues with other people in our lives because of that, on either side. So as a sanguine, you need to think a little bit more before you say, and as a perfect melancholy, you have to not take things so seriously sometimes. Okay, the third is the powerful choleric. They're extroverts and optimists. Their goal is control and achievement. New Testament example is Paul, the Apostle Paul. They're known as the doers. And the animal that corresponds with this from the other study is the lion. These are your natural-born leaders. They take control in a crisis. They're great problem solvers. They will make quick decisions. They can run anything. They're great delegators. This is when you're in a small group and they say, okay, now talk amongst yourselves. You see it at Bible study. They'll say, okay, this is the person that rises up to take over the group. Or it's the person everybody looks to. Even if they don't want to do it, everybody looks to them to do it. They have a very strong personality, so they're powerful and dynamic. They tend to be very bold. High energy, very determined. They exude confidence. And this one is my main temperament, the powerful choleric. And I remember when I was in high school, we had an intro to speech class, a public speaking class, and it was, I guess, towards the end of the semester, maybe it was around Christmas time, I don't recall. But our teacher did an exercise where he gave everybody a piece of cardboard about this big, and we strung it around our necks, and it was on our backs. And then everybody went around and wrote something nice about everybody else. And of course, you didn't know who wrote what, and I can't tell you how many people wrote confident, has it all together. And I'm thinking, do you people know me at all? So it doesn't necessarily mean they are that way, but that is how they come off. That is how they come off. They're independent and self-reliant. They always have an opinion about everything, and often feel very, very like they want to share it. And they're usually right. Now that one does not apply to me in this, but if the person who it's frustrating because they're always right. That's probably a choleric. They are achievers. They can accomplish more than any of the other temperaments. They thrive on opposition. It feeds them. It doesn't hinder them. It feeds them. They tend to be more goal-oriented than people-oriented, and they're very efficient. Now, weaknesses. Okay, so they're natural-born leaders, but of course, when that's out of control, they get very bossy because they want to control people, and they can manipulate people because of their dominant personality. They can intimidate people to do what they want them to do. They also tend to have a compulsion to correct wrongs. If they see something that's not right, they are going to speak up and say it. They have strong personalities, which can be a good thing, but they can also be very overbearing. They're highly competitive. They want to win at any cost. They'd rather be proven right than be popular. That's one thing that when I read that, I was like, oh my gosh, I could see that in me. Like I'm hammering my point, and the person on the other side is just like being crushed. And I don't care, because I'm right, and you're going to know I'm right. I mean, it was just hard, very hard to see. They also are the ones that tend to think that nothing is wrong with them. And this, I have to share another very unflattering but true, how this fits me. Hopefully not anymore, not as much anymore, but it was in 1988. I was pregnant with Andrew. My husband and I were staying with friends because we were going to a week-long seminar, Christian seminar. And the gal had the book. It was probably the Tim LaHaye book. It probably wasn't this one on the temperaments. I had never heard anything about it before, and she was telling me about it. I'm like, that sounds so cool. So I remember sitting down and looking at the book, and I'm looking through it, and it lists all the traits, the positives and the negatives of each one. And I remember looking through it, and honestly, and I'm so not proud of this, but honestly thinking, I have the good ones, but I really don't have the bad ones. And I remember feeling bad about that, knowing it couldn't be, but honestly, that's how I felt. So I put the book away, and I didn't say another word about it. 10 years later, a friend of mine discovered the Personality Plus book, and I was terrified. I thought, Lord, I know I was not in a good place when I saw this last time, but I really want to be open to what you have for me. And I read the book, and I could clearly see at that point my faults. The book is written by, she's a counselor. And so all the examples are true examples. She's not making up scenarios. It's people that she's met. And one she shared that just helped me to feel so much better not about myself, but it just helped me to feel better overall. She said a couple had come up to her after the seminar, and the wife is all like, oh, it was so great and all this stuff. And the husband's like, well, yeah, I looked at that, but I only have all the good ones. And she said, because he was a choleric. I thought, okay, I guess I'm not the only one who specifically thought that. Not that it's good, not that it's right, but it confirmed that, yeah, this is my dominant one. So they tend not to be merciful. They love controversy, they love arguments, they love to debate. They're achievers, but they tend to be compulsive workers. They're the kind of people who can't sit down and do nothing. They really can't rest. They tend to be impatient. Their ability to accomplish often hinders their relationship because, again, they're more goal-oriented than people-oriented. And they're more concerned about getting things done than about the feelings of others. Now, one aspect of this that really helped me to understand me better, from when we first got married, when Gary comes home from work, I always would greet him. And then he would always go upstairs and get changed. And I'd always go up with him, even when the kids were little, just to get, even if it was just 5 minutes, the two of us together. And, I still do that now. Of course, our kids are grown and out of the house. And I remember I'd say, how was your day? And he'd tell me. He's not a talker like I am. And then I would proceed to tell him what I did during my day. And it got to the point where I felt compelled to tell him what I did, almost to justify my time as a stay-at-home mom, which I have been. The first year we were married, I worked. But after that, Andrew was born, and I had the opportunity to be a stay-at-home mom. And it bothered me because he didn't care. Not that he didn't care about what I did, but he's a phlegmatic. We're going to get to them. They're the calm, cool, collected ones. It's not like he was like, well, so what'd you do today? Because, you were home all day. He's not that way. But it was this need I had. I felt I had to justify my time. And then when I read this, and it talks about how clerics, they judge themselves, they gauge themselves by how much they accomplish. That's where their identity is. And it was so freeing to realize, no, my identity's in Christ. I don't have to defend myself to my husband. I just have to do what God calls me to do each day. And so I would still tell him what I did, but it wasn't like I felt like I had to remember everything. It was very freeing for me. It was just very freeing, and it was very helpful in the sense that it helped me to get my eyes where they needed to be, instead of gauging them on what I did, gauging on who I am, and then what God allowed me to accomplish that day. The final one are the peaceful phlegmatics.
Let's do one with grab out of room.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
I'm sorry. There you go.
Uh-huh.
I can use the front here.
Okay. Peaceful phlegmatics. These are introverts and pessimists. Their goal is peace. And Jacob, in the Old Testament, Jacob is the biblical example. They are the watchers. The animal that Smalley and Trent attribute to them is the golden retriever. These are your quiet and unassuming people. They're adaptable, they're tolerant, they don't jump right in, they wait to be asked to get involved. They're not looking for credit. They're humble and gentle. They tend to be very good listeners and sympathetic. They're peaceful, they're comfortable, they're well-rounded. They tend to have a very low profile. They tend to have dry humor. And these are the people who the Melancholies have that perfectly coiffed and groomed. These are kind of the low-maintenance look people. These are, not that they're messy or sloppy, but that's just not a big deal to them. And that makes sense because they're just kind of easygoing people. They're a very balanced person. No extremes, no excesses, kind of middle of the road. They avoid conflicts and decisions. They're calm and they're slow to anger. They're never impulsive. These are the logical people. They're also very reliable. They're loyal. They're patient. Again, calm, cool, and collected. To me, that is the best description of your phlegmatics. They're never in a hurry. They accept life and they're reconciled to reality. They don't take life too seriously. They don't take themselves too seriously. They have low-key personality. They're pessimists, but they don't tend towards depression. They're not gloomy like the Melancholies can struggle with. They're more realists as opposed to having a negative view. They just kind of take life as it is. Weaknesses. They're quiet and unassuming, but that means they're unenthusiastic about things. They don't really need entertainment, so they don't think anyone else does, and that can be difficult because they tend to marry cholerics who are out there and you need to be with people. They're balanced, but they need direction oftentimes and motivation. So they, they're kind of this easygoing, but they need someone to kind of motivate them, but then they resent being pushed. So that's sort of a fine line. They can be extremely lazy. They procrastinate. Now remember, the Melancholies procrastinate because everything has to be perfect. The Phlegmatics, they procrastinate because they don't want to do it. So they just keep putting it off in hopes that they'll never actually have to do it. They tend to be unmotivated. They accept life as it comes, but they also avoid conflict at all costs. So these are the people that don't communicate their feelings. They'd rather kind of keep it in. They think it's easier. They're kind of the peace at any price. It's easier to just avoid the conflict altogether. They never make decisions because they don't want the accountability. If we decide we're going to go to this restaurant and it doesn't work out, well, you can't point to me because I didn't recommend it. They have a hard time saying no. These are the people that tend to get overcommitted with things, and they dislike change. Now, I think all of us, to some extent, have issues with change, but they really dislike it. So those are the 4 temperaments, and what's really neat is you see Christ truly embodies all the positive qualities of all 4 temperaments. He's a sanguine. He motivated people. He was captivating. He told stories. A lot of his teaching was in parables. He was a melancholy in the sense that he was deep, and he was sensitive, and he was thoughtful. He was a choleric. He was a dynamic leader. I mean, you see several scriptures that talk about how he taught with authority. He had that presence. And he was phlegmatic in that he was calm and gentle. So these are the temperaments. It's important for us to keep it in balance with everything else of ourselves. We can't realize this is just one piece of the puzzle that can help us to understand ourselves better and those around us better. But hopefully, as I described them, you saw yourself in one. Maybe you saw your husband or your kids. And it can just help us to direct them more because we know what their motivation is. So we can direct them into the positive qualities and then help curb some of the negative ones, some of the extremes that it can go to.